And the great difference between man and monkey is in the larynx, he continued, in the incapacity to frame delicately different sound symbols by which thought could be sustained. In this I failed to agree with him, but with a certain incivility he declined to notice my objection. He repeated the thing was so, and continued his account of his work. I asked him why he had taken the human form as a model. There seemed to me then, and there still seems to me now, a strange wickedness for that choice. He confessed that he had chosen that form by chance. I might well have worked to form sheep into llamas and llamas into sheep. I suppose there is something in the human form that appeals to the artistic turn of mind more powerfully than any animal shape can, but I've not confined myself to man-making. Once or twice... He was silent. For a minute, perhaps. These years, how they have slipped by. And here I have wasted a day saving your life, and am now wasting an hour explaining myself. But, said I still do not understand. Where is your justification for inflicting all this pain? The only thing that could excuse vivisection to me would be some application of precisely, he said. But you see, I am differently constituted. We're on different platforms. You are a materialist. I am not a materialist, I began hotly. In my view. For it is just this question of pain that parts us. So long as visible or audible pain turns you sick, so long as your own pains drive you, so long as pain underlies your propositions about sin, so long, I tell you, you are an animal, thinking a little less obscurely what an animal feels. This pain, I gave an impatient shrug at such sophistry. Oh, but it is such a little thing. A mind truly opened to what science has to teach us must see that it is a little thing. It may be that, save in this little planet, this speck of cosmic dust, invisible long before the nearest star could be attained, it may be, I say, that nowhere else does this thing called pain occur. But the laws we feel our way towards, why, even on this earth, even among living things, what pain is there? As he spoke, he drew a little penknife from his pocket, opened the smaller blade and moved his chair so that I could see his thigh. Then, choosing the place deliberately, he drove the blade into his leg and withdrew it. No doubt, he said, you have seen that before. It does not hurt a pinprick, but what does it show? The capacity for pain is not indeed in the muscle, and it is not placed there, is but little needed in the skin, and only here and there over the thigh is a spot capable of feeling pain. Pain is simply our intrinsic medical advisor to warn us and stimulate us. Not all living flesh is painful, nor is all nerve, nor even all sensory nerve. There's no taint of pain, real pain in the sensations of the optic nerve. If you wound the optic nerve, you merely see flashes of light, just as disease of the auditory nerve merely means a humming in our ears. Plants do not feel pain, nor the lower animals. It's possible that such animals as the starfish and crayfish do not feel pain at all. Then with men, the more intelligent they become, the more intelligently they will see after their own welfare, and the less they will need the goad to keep them out of danger. I never yet heard of a useless thing that was not ground out of existence by evolution sooner or later. Did you? And pain gets needless. Then I am a religious man, Prendick, as every sane man must be. It may be, I fancy, that I have seen more of the ways of the world's maker than you, for I have sought his laws in my way all my life, while you, I understand, have been collecting butterflies. And I tell you, pleasure and pain have nothing to do with heaven or hell. Pleasure and pain. Bah! What is your theologian's ecstasy but Mahomet's houri in the dark? This store which men, women set on pleasure and pain, Prendick, is the mark of the beast upon them, the mark of the beast from which they came. Pain, and pleasure, they are for us only so long as we wriggle in the dust. You see, I went on with this research just the way it led me. That is the only way I ever heard of true research going. I asked a question, devised some method of obtaining an answer, and got a fresh question. Was this possible, or that possible? You cannot imagine what this means to an investigator, what an intellectual passion grows upon him. You cannot imagine the strange, colourless delight of these intellectual desires. The thing before you is no longer an animal, a fellow creature, but a problem. Sympathetic pain, all I know of it, I remember as a thing I used to suffer from years ago. It was one thing I wanted, to find out the extreme limit of plasticity in a living shape. But, said I, the thing is an abomination. To this day, I have never troubled about the ethics of the matter, he continued. The study of nature makes a man at last as remorseless as nature. I have gone on, not heeding anything but the question I was pursuing, and the material has dripped into the huts yonder. It is nearly 11 years since we came here. I and Montgomery and 6 Kanakas. I remember the green stillness of the island and the empty ocean about us as though it was yesterday. The place seemed waiting for me. The stores were landed and the house was built. The Kanakas founded some huts near the ravine. I went to work here upon what I had brought with me. There were some disagreeable things happened at first. I began with a sheep and killed it after a day and a half by a slip of the scalpel. I took another sheep and made a thing of pain and fear and left it bound up to heal. It looked quite human to me when I had finished it, but when I went to it, I was discontented with it. It remembered me and was terrified beyond imagination, and it had no more than the wits of a sheep. The more I looked at it, the clumsier it seemed, until at last I put the monster out of its misery. These animals without courage, these fear-haunted, pain-driven things, without a spark of the pugnacious energy to face torment, they are no good for man-making. Then I took a gorilla I had, and upon that, working with infinite care and mastering difficulty after difficulty, I made my first man. All the week, night and day, I moulded him. With him it was chiefly the brain that needed moulding. Much had to be added, much changed. I thought him a fair specimen of the negroid type when I had finished him, and he lay bandaged, bound, and motionless before me. It was only when his life was assured that I left him and came into this room again and found Montgomery much as you are. He had heard some of the cries of the thing grew human, cries like those that disturbed you so. I didn't take him completely into my confidence at first, and the Kanakas too had realized something of it. They were scared out of their wits by the sight of me. I got Montgomery over to me, in a way, but I and he had the hardest job to prevent the Kanakas deserting. Finally they did, and so we lost the yacht. I spent many days educating the brute. Altogether I had him 3 or 4 months. I taught him the rudiments of English, gave him ideas of counting, even made the thing read the alphabet. But at that he was slow, though I've met with idiots slower. He began with a clean sheet, mentally. No memories left in his mind of what he had seen. When his scars were quite healed and he was no longer anything but painful and stiff and able to converse a little, I took him yonder and introduced him to the Kanakas as an interesting stowaway. They were horribly afraid of him at first. Somehow, which offended me rather, for I was conceited about him. But his ways seemed so mild and he was so abject that after a time they received him and took his education in hand. He was quick to learn, very imitative and adaptive, and built himself a hovel, rather better, it seemed to me, than their own shanties. There was one among the boys a bit of a missionary, and he taught the thing to read, or at least pick out letters, and gave him some rudimentary ideas of mortality, but it seems the beast's habits were not all that is desirable. I rested from work for some days after this, and was in a mind to write an account of the whole affair, to wake up English physiology. Then I came upon the creature, squatting up in a tree and gibbering at two of the Kanakas who had been teasing him. I threatened him, told him the inhumanity of such a proceeding, aroused his sense of shame, and came home resolved to do better before I took my work back to England. I have been doing better. But somehow the things drift back again. The stubborn beast flesh grows day by day back again. But I mean to do better things still. I mean to conquer that. This puma... But that's the story. All the Kanaka boys are dead now. One fell overboard of the launch, and one died of a wounded heel that he poisoned in some way with plant juice. 3 went away in the yacht, and I suppose, and Hope were drowned. The other one was killed. Well, I have replaced them. Montgomery went on much as you are disposed to do at first, and then...
What became of the other one? Said I, sharply. The other Kanaka who was killed.
The fact is, after I'd made a number of human creatures, I made a... thing.
He hesitated. Yes, said I.
It was killed.
I don't understand, said I.
Do you mean to say it killed the Kanaka? Yes. Killed several other things that it caught. We chased it for a couple of days. It only got loose by accident. I never meant it to get away. It wasn't finished. It was purely an experiment. It was a limbless thing with a horrible face that writhed around the ground in a serpentine fashion. It was immensely strong and in infuriating pain. It lurked in the woods for some days until we hunted it, and then it wriggled into the northern part of the island, and we divided the party to close in upon it. Montgomery insisted on coming with me. The man had a rifle, and when his body was found, one of the barrels was curved into the shape of an S, and very nearly bitten through. Montgomery shot the thing. After that, I had stuck to the ideal of humanity. Except for little things.
He became silent. I sat in silence, watching his face.
So for 20 years together, counting 9 years in England, I have been going on. And there is still something in everything I do that defeats me, makes me dissatisfied, challenges me to further effort. Sometimes I rise above my level, sometimes I fall below it, but I always fall short of the things I dream. The human shape I can get now almost with ease, so that it is lithe and graceful or thick and strong, but often there is trouble with the hands and the claws, painful things that I dare not shape too freely. But it is in the subtle grafting and reshaping one must needs do to the brain that my trouble lies. The intelligence is often oddly low, with unaccountable blank ends, unexpected gaps, and least satisfactory of all is something that I cannot touch. Somewhere, I cannot determine where, in the seat of the emotions. Cravings, instincts, desire that harm humanity, a strange hidden reservoir to burst forth suddenly and inundate the whole being of the creature with anger, hate, or fear. These creatures of mine seem strange and uncanny to you so soon as you begin to observe them, but to me, just after I make them, they seem to be indisputably human beings. It's afterwards, as I observe them, that the persuasion fades. First one animal trait, then another creeps to the surface and stares out at me, but I will conquer yet. Every time I dip a living creature into the bath of burning pain, I say, this time I will burn out all the animal. This time I will make a rational creature of my own. After all, what is 10 years? Men have been 100,000 in the making. He thought darkly. But I am drawing near the fastness. This puma of mine. After a silence. And they revert. As soon as my hand is taken from them, the beast begins to creep back, begins to assert itself again.
Another long silence. Then you take the things you make into those dens, said I.
They go. Turn them out when I begin to feel the beast in them, and presently they wander there. They all dread this house, and me. There is a kind of travesty of humanity over there. Montgomery knows about it, for he interferes in their affairs. He has trained one or two of them to our service. He's ashamed of it, but I believe he half likes some of those beasts. It's his business, not mine. They only sicken me with a sense of failure. I take no interest in them. I fancy they follow in the lines of the Kanaka missionary marked out, and have a kind of mockery of rational life, poor beasts. There's something they call the law, sing hymns about all thine. They build themselves their dens, gather fruit and pull herbs, marry, even. But I can see through it all, see into their very souls, and see they're nothing but the souls of beasts, beasts that perish, anger and the lusts to live and gratify themselves. Yet they are odd, complex like everything else alive. There is a kind of upward striving in them, part vanity, part waste sexual emotion, part waste curiosity. It only mocks me. I have some hope of this puma. I have worked hard at her head and brain. And now, said he, standing up after a long gap of silence, during which we had each pursued our own thoughts, what do you think? Are you in fear of me still? I looked at him and saw but a white-faced, white-haired man with calm eyes. Save for his serenity, the touch almost of beauty that resulted from his set tranquillity and his magnificent build, he might have passed muster among 100 other comfortable old gentlemen. Then I shivered. By way of answer to his second question, I handed him a revolver with each hand. Keep them, he said, and snatched at a yawn. He stood up, stared at me for a moment and smiled. You have had 2 eventful days, said he. I should advise some sleep. I'm glad it's all clear. Good night. He thought over me for a moment, then went out by the inner door. I immediately turned the key in the outer one. I sat down again, sat for a time in a kind of stagnant mood, so weary emotionally, mentally and physically, that I could not think beyond the point at which he had left me. The black window stared at me like an eye. At last, with an effort, I put out the light and got into the hammock. Very soon I was asleep. Chapter 15. Concerning the Beast Folk. I woke early. Moreau's explanations stood before my mind, clear and definite from the moment of my awakening. I got out of the hammock and went to the door to assure myself that the key was turned. Then I tried the window bar and found it firmly fixed. That these man-like creatures were in truth only bestial monsters, mere grotesque travesties of men, filled me with a vague uncertainty of their possibilities, which was far worse than any definite fear. A tapping came at the door, and I heard the glutinous accents of Ling speaking. I pocketed one of the revolvers, keeping one hand upon it, and opened to him. Good morning, sir, he said, bringing in addition to the customary herb breakfast, an ill-cooked rabbit. Montgomery followed him. His roving eye caught the position of my arm, and he smiled askew. The puma was resting to heal that day, but Moreau, who was singularly solitary in his habits, did not join us. I talked with Montgomery to clear my ideas of the way in which the beast folk lived. In particular, I was urgent to know how these inhuman monsters were kept from falling upon Moreau and Montgomery and from rending one another. He explained to me that the comparative safety of Moreau and himself was due to the limited mental scope of these monsters. In spite of their increased intelligence and the tendency of their animal instincts to reawaken, they had certain fixed ideas implanted by Moreau in their minds, which absolutely bounded their imaginations. They were really hypnotized, had been told that certain things were impossible and that certain things were not to be done, and these prohibitions were woven into the texture of their minds beyond any possibility of disobedience or dispute. Certain matters, however, in which old instinct was at war with Moreau's convenience, were in a less stable condition. A series of propositions called the law, I had already heard them recited, battled in their minds with the deep-seated, ever-rebellious cravings of their animal natures. This law they were ever repeating, I found, and ever breaking.
Both Montgomery and Moreau displayed particular solicitude to keep them ignorant of the taste of blood. They feared the inevitable suggestions of that flavour. Montgomery told me that the law, especially among the feline beast people, became oddly weakened about nightfall, that then the animal was at its strongest, that a spirit of adventure sprang up in them at dusk, when they would dare things they never seemed to dream about by day. To that I owed my stalking by the Leopard Man on the night of my arrival. But during these earlier days of my stay, they broke the law only furtively and after dark. In the daylight there was a general atmosphere of respect for its multifarious prohibitions. And here perhaps I may give a few general facts about the island of the beast people. The island, which was of irregular outline and lay low upon the wide sea, had a total area, I suppose, of 7 or 8 square miles. It was volcanic in origin, and was now fringed on 3 sides by coral reefs. Some fumaroles to the northward and a hot spring were the only vestiges of the forces that had long since originated it. Now and then a faint quiver of earthquake would be sensible, and sometimes the ascent of the spire of smoke would be rendered tumultuous by gusts of steam, but that was all. The population of the island, Montgomery informed me, now numbered rather more than 60 of these strange creatures of Moreau's art, not counting the smaller monstrosities which lived in the undergrowth and were without human form. Altogether he had made nearly 120, but many had died, and others, like the writhing, footless thing of which he had told me, had come by violent ends. In answer to my question, Montgomery said that they actually bore offspring, but that these generally died. When they lived, Moreau took them and stamped the human form upon them. There was no evidence of the inheritance of their acquired human characteristics. The females were less numerous than the males and liable to much furtive persecution in spite of the monogamy the law enjoyed. It would be impossible for me to describe these beast people in detail. My eye had no training in details, and unhappily I cannot sketch. Most striking, perhaps, in their general appearance, was the disproportion between the legs of these creatures and the length of their bodies. And yet, so relative is our idea of grace, my eye became habituated to their forms, and at last I even fell in with their persuasion that my own long thighs were ungainly. Another point was the forward carriage of the head and the clumsy and inhuman curvature of the spine. Even the ape man lacked that inward sinuous curve of the back which makes the human figure so graceful. Most had their shoulders hunched clumsily and their short forearms hung weakly at their sides. Few of them were conspicuously hairy, at least until the end of my time upon the island. The next most obvious deformity was in their faces, almost all of which were prognathous, malformed about the ears with large and protuberant noses, very furry or very bristly hair, and often strangely coloured or strangely placed eyes. None could laugh, though the ape-man had a chattering titter. Beyond these general characters, their heads had little in common. Each preserved the quality of its particular species. The human mark distorted but did not hide the leopard, the ox, or the sow, or other animal or animals from which the creature had been moulded. Their voices, too, varied exceedingly. The hands were always malformed, and though some surprised me by their unexpected human appearance, almost all were deficient in the number of digits, clumsily about the fingernails and lacking any tactile sensibility. The 2 most formidable animal men were my leopard man and a creature made of hyena and swine. Larger than these were the 3 bull creatures who pulled the boat. Then came the silvery, hairy man who was also the sayer of the law, an emling, a satyr-like creature of ape and goat. There were 3 swine men and a swine woman, a mare rhinoceros creature, and several other females whose sources I did not ascertain. There were several wolf creatures, a bear bull, and a St. Bernard man. I have already described the ape man, and there was a particularly hateful and evil-smelling old woman made of vixen and bear, whom I hated from the beginning. She was said to be a passionate votary of the law. Smaller creatures were certain dappled youths, and my little sloth creature, but enough of this catalogue. At first I had a shivering horror of the brutes, felt all too keenly that they were still brutes, but insensibly I became a little habituated to the idea of them, and, moreover, I was affected by Montgomery's attitude towards them. He had been with them so long that he had come to regard them as almost normal human beings. His London days seemed a glorious impossible past to him. Only once a year or so did he go to Arica to deal with Moreau's agent, a trader in animals there. He hardly met the finest type of mankind in that seafaring village of Spanish mongrels. The men aboard the ship, he told me, seemed at first just as strange to him as the beast men seemed to me. Unnaturally long in the leg, flat in the face, prominent in the forehead, suspicious, dangerous, and cold-hearted. In fact, he did not like men. His heart had warmed to me, he thought, because he had saved my life. I fancied even then that he had a sneaking kindness for some of these metamorphosed brutes, a vicious sympathy with some of their ways, but that he attempted to veil it from me at first. Emling, the black-faced man, Montgomery's attendant, the first of the beast folk I had encountered, did not live with the others across the island, but in a small kennel at the back of the enclosure. The creature was scarcely so intelligent as the ape man, but far more docile, and the most human-looking of all the beast folk. And Montgomery had trained it to prepare food, and indeed to discharge all the trivial domestic offices that were required. It was a complex trophy of Moreau's horrible skill, a bear tainted with dog and ox, and one of the most elaborately made of all his creatures. It treated Montgomery with a strange tenderness and devotion. Sometimes he would notice it, pat it, call it half-mocking, half-jocular names, and so make it caper with extraordinary delight. Sometimes he would ill-treat it, especially after he had been at the whiskey, kicking it, beating it, pelting it with stones or lighted fusees. But whether he treated it ill or well, it loved nothing so much as to be near him. I say I became habituated to the beast people, that 1,000 things which had seemed unnatural and repulsive speedily became natural and ordinary to me. I suppose everything in existence takes its colour from the average hue of our surroundings. Montgomery and Moreau were too peculiar and individual to keep my general impressions of humanity well defined. I would see one of the clumsy bovine creatures who worked the launch treading heavily through the undergrowth and find myself asking, trying hard to recall, how he differed from some really human yokel trudging home from his mechanical labours. Or I would meet the fox-bear woman's vulpine, shifty face, strangely human in its speculative cunning, and imagine even I had met it before in some city byway. Yet every now and then the beast would flash out upon me beyond doubt or denial. An ugly-looking man, a hunchback human savage to all appearance, squatting in the aperture of one of the dens, would stretch his arms and yawn, showing, with startling suddenness, scissor-edged incisors or sabre-like canines, keen and brilliant as knives. Or in some narrow pathway, glancing with a transitory daring into the eyes of some lithe, white-swathed female figure, I would suddenly see, with a spasmodic revulsion, that she had slit-like pupils, or, glancing down, note the curving nail with which she held her shapeless wrap about her. It is a curious thing, by the by, for which I am quite unable to account, that these weird creatures, the females I mean, had in the earlier days of my stay an instinctive sense of their own repulsive calmness, and displayed in consequence a more than human regard for the decency and decorum of extensive costume. Chapter 16. How the Beast Folk Taste Blood. My inexperience as a writer betrays me, and I wander from the thread of my story. After I'd breakfasted with Montgomery, he took me across the island to see the fumarole and the source of the hot spring into whose scalding waters I had blundered on the previous day. Both of us carried whips and loaded revolvers. While going through a leafy jungle on our road thither, we heard a rabbit squealing. We stopped and listened, but we heard no more, and presently we went on our way, and the incident dropped out of our minds. Montgomery called my attention to certain little pink animals with long hind legs that went leaping through the undergrowth. He told me they were creatures made of the offspring of the beast people that Moreau had invented. He had fancied they might serve for meat, but a rabbit-like habit of devouring their young had defeated this intention. I had already encountered some of these creatures, once during my moonlight flight from the leopard man, and once during my pursuit by Moreau on the previous day. By chance, one, hopping to avoid us, leapt into the hole caused by the uprooting of a wind-blown tree. Before it could extricate itself, we managed to catch it. It spat like a cat, scratched and kicked vigorously with its hind legs and made an attempt to bite, but its teeth were too feeble to inflict more than a painless pinch. It seemed to me rather a pretty little creature, and as Moreau stated that it never destroyed the turf by burrowing and was very cleanly in its habits, I should imagine it might prove a convenient substitute for the common rabbit in gentlemen's parks. We also saw on our way the trunk of a tree barked in long strips and splintered deeply. Montgomery called my attention to this.
"Not to claw the bark of trees, that is the law," he said. "Much some of them care for it."
It was after this, I think, that we met the satyr and the ape man. The satire was a gleam of classical memory on the part of Moreau, his face ovine in expression, like the coarser Hebrew type, his voice a harsh bleat, and his nether extremities satanic. He was gnawing the husk of a pod-like fruit as he passed us. Both of them saluted Montgomery.
"Hi-yo,"
said they.
"To the other with the whip."
"There's a third with a whip now," said Montgomery, "so you'd better mind."
"Was he not made?"
said the ape man.
He said he was made."
The satire man looked curiously at me.
"The third with the whip, he that walks weeping into the sea, has a thin white face."
"He has a long, thin whip," said Montgomery.
"Yesterday he bled and wept," said the satire. "You never bleed nor weep. The master does not bleed or weep."
"Ollendorfian beggar,"
said Montgomery.
"You'll bleed and weep if you don't look out."
"He has 5 fingers. He has a 5-man like me,"
said the ape man.
"Come along, Prendick,"
said Montgomery, taking my arm, and I went on with him. The satire and the ape man stood watching us and making other remarks to each other.
"He says nothing,"
said the satire.
"Men have voices. Yesterday he asked me of things to eat,"
said the ape man.
"He did not know."
Then they spoke inaudible things, and I heard the satire laughing. It was on our way back that we came upon the dead rabbit. The red body of the wretched little beast was rent to pieces, many of the ribs stripped white and the backbone indisputably gnawed. At that, Montgomery stopped.
"Good God,"
said he, stooping down and picking up some of the crushed vertebrae to examine them more closely.
"Good God,"
he repeated.
"What can this mean?"
"Some carnivore of yours has remembered its old habits," I said after a pause. "This backbone has been bitten through." He stood staring, with his face white and his lip pulled askew.
"I don't like this,"
he said slowly. "I saw something of the same kind," said I, "the first day I came here."
"The devil you did! What was it?"
"A rabbit, with its head twisted off."
"The day you came here?"
"The day I came here, in the undergrowth, at the back of the enclosure when I went out in the evening. The head was completely wrung off." He gave a long, low whistle. "And what is more, I have an idea which of your brutes did the thing. It's only a suspicion, you know. Before I came on the rabbit, I saw one of your monsters drinking in the stream."
"Sucking his drink?"
"Yes."
"Not to suck your drink, that is the law. Much the brutes care for the law, when Moreau's not about."
"It was the brute who chased me."
"Of course," said Montgomery. "It's just the way with carnivores. After a kill, they drink. It's the taste of blood, you know." "What was the brute like?" he continued. "Would you know him again?"
He glanced about us, standing astride over the mess of dead rabbit, his eyes roving among the shadows and screens of greenery, the lurking places and ambuscades of the forest that bounded us in.
"The taste of blood,"
he said again. He took out his revolver, examined the cartridges in it and replaced it. Then he began to pull at his dropping lip. "I think I should know the brute again," I said. "I stunned him. He ought to have a handsome bruise on the forehead of him."
"But then we have to prove that he killed the rabbit,"
said Montgomery.
"I wish I'd never brought the things here."
I should have gone on, but he stayed there, thinking over the mangled rabbit in a puzzle-headed way. As it was, I went to such a distance that the rabbit's remains were hidden. "Come on," I said. Presently he woke up and came towards me.
"You see," he said, almost in a whisper. They're all supposed to have a fixed idea against eating anything that runs on land. If some brute has by accident tasted blood...
We went on some way in silence.
I wonder what can have happened,
he said to himself. Then, after a pause again,
I did a foolish thing the other day. That servant of mine, I showed him how to skin and cook a rabbit. It's odd. I saw him licking his hands. It never occurred to me.
Then,
we must put a stop to this. I must tell Moreau.
He could think of nothing else on our homeward journey. Moreau took the matter even more seriously than Montgomery, and I need scarcely say that I was affected by their evident consternation.
We must make an example, said Moreau. I have no doubt in my mind that the leopard man was the sinner, but how can we prove it? I wish, Montgomery, you had kept your taste for meat in hand and gone without these exciting novelties. We may find ourselves in a mess yet through it.
I was a silly ass, said Montgomery. But the thing's done now, and you said I might have them, you know.
We must see to the thing at once, said Moreau. I suppose if anything should turn up, Emling can take care of himself?
I'm not so sure of Emling, said Montgomery. I think I ought to know him.
In the afternoon, Moreau, Montgomery, myself and Emling went across the island to the huts in the ravine. We three were armed. Emling carried the little hatchet he used in chopping firewood and some coils of wire. Moreau had a huge cowherd's horn slung over his shoulder.
You will see a gathering of the beast people, said Montgomery. It is a pretty sight.
Moreau said not a word on the way, but the expression of his heavy, white, fringed face was grimly set. We crossed the ravine down which smoked the stream of the hot water, and followed the winding pathway through the canebrakes until we reached a wide area, covered over with thick, powdery yellow substance which I believe was sulphur. Above the shoulder of the weedy bank the sea glittered. We came to a kind of shallow, natural amphitheatre, and here the four of us halted. Then Moreau sounded the horn and broke the sleeping stillness of the tropical afternoon. He must have had strong lungs. The hooting note rose and rose amidst its echoes to at last an ear-penetrating intensity.
Ah,
said Moreau, letting the curved instrument fall to his side again. Immediately there was a crashing through the yellow canes, and a sound of voices from the dense green jungle that marked the morass through which I had run on the previous day. Then, at 3 or 4 points on the edge of the sulphurous area, appeared the grotesque forms of the beast people hurrying towards us. I could not help a creeping horror as I perceived first one and then another trot out from the trees or reeds and come shambling along over the hot dust. But Moreau and Montgomery stood calmly enough, and, perforce, I stuck beside them. First to arrive was the satyr, strangely unreal for all that he cast a shadow and tossed the dust with his hooves. After him, from a break, came the monstrous lout, a thing of horse and rhinoceros chewing straw as it came. Then appeared the swine women and 2 wolf women, then the fox-bear witch with her red eyes and her peaked red face, and then others, all hurrying eagerly. As they came forward, they began to cringe towards Moreau and chant, quite regardless of one another, fragments of the latter half of the litany of the law. His is the hand that wounds, his is the hand that heals, and so forth. As soon as they had approached within a distance of perhaps 30 yards, they halted, and bowing on their knees and elbows, began flinging the white dust upon their heads. Imagine the scene, if you can. We 3 blue-clad men, with our misshapen black-faced attendant, standing in a wide expanse of sunlit yellow dust under the blazing blue sky, and surrounded by this circle of crouching and gesticulating monstrosities, some almost human save in their subtle expressions and gestures, some like cripples, some so strangely distorted as to resemble nothing but the denizens of our wildest dreams. And beyond the reedy lines of a canebrake in one direction, a dense tangle of palm trees on the other, separating us from the ravine with the huts, and to the north, the hazy horizon of the Pacific Ocean.
62, 63, counted Moreau. There are 4 more.
I do not see the leopard man, said I. Presently Moreau sounded the great horn again, and at the sound of it all the beast people writhed and grovelled in the dust. Then, slinking out of the canebrake, stooping near the ground and trying to join the dust-throwing circle behind Moreau's back, came the leopard man. The last of the beast people to arrive was the Little Ape Man. The earlier animals, hot and weary with their grovelling, shot vicious glances at him.
"Cease!"
said Moreau in a firm, loud voice, and the beast people sat back upon their hams and rested from their worshipping.
"Where is the sayer of the law?"
said Moreau, and the hairy grey monster bowed his face in the dust.
"Say the words," said Moreau.
Forthwith, all in the kneeling assembly, swaying from side to side and dashing up the sulphur with their hands, first the right hand in a puff of dust, and then the left, began once more to chant their strange litany. When they reached "not to eat flesh or fish, that is the law," Moreau held up his lank, white hand.
"Stop!"
he cried, and there fell absolute silence upon them all. I think they all knew and dreaded what was coming. I looked round at their strange faces. When I saw their wincing attitudes and the furtive dread in their bright eyes, I wondered that I had ever believed them to be men.
"That law has been broken,"
said Moreau.
"None escape,"
from the faceless creature with the silvery hair. "None escape," repeated the kneeling circle of beast people.
"Who is he?"
cried Moreau, and looked round at their faces, cracking his whip. I fancied the hyena swine looked dejected, so too did the leopard man. Moreau stopped, facing this creature who cringed towards him with the memory and dread of infinite torment.
"Who is he?"
repeated Moreau, in a voice of thunder.
"Evil is he who breaks the law,"
chanted the sayer of the law. Moreau looked into the eyes of the leopard man and seemed to be dragging the very soul out of the creature.
"Who breaks the law?"
said Moreau, taking his eyes off his victim and turning towards us. It seemed to me there was a touch of exultation in his voice.
"Goes back to the house of pain," they all clamoured. "Goes back to the house of pain, oh master!"
"Back to the house of pain, back to the house of pain,"
gabbled the ape man as though the idea was sweet to him.
"Do you hear?"
said Moreau, turning back to the criminal.
"My friend? Hello?"
For the leopard man, released from Moreau's eye, had risen straight from his knees, and now with eyes aflame and his huge feline tusks flashing out from under his curling lips, leapt towards his tormentor. I am convinced that only the madness of unendurable fear could have prompted this attack. The whole circle of 80 monsters seemed to rise about us. I drew my revolver. The two figures collided. I saw Moreau reeling back from the leopard man's blow. There was a furious yelling and howling all about us. Everyone was moving rapidly. For a moment I thought it was a general revolt. The furious face of the leopard man flashed by mine, with Emling close in pursuit. I saw the yellow eyes of the hyena swine blazing with excitement, his attitude as if he were half resolved to attack me. The satyr, too, glared at me over the hyena swine's hunched shoulders. I heard the crack of Moreau's pistol, and saw the pink flash dart across the tumult. The whole crowd seemed to swing round in the direction of the glint of fire, and I, too, was swung round by the magnetism of the movement. In another second, I was running, one of a tumultuous shooting crowd in pursuit of the escaping leopard man. That is all I can tell, definitely. I saw the leopard man strike Moreau, and then everything spun about me until I was running headlong. Emling was ahead, close in pursuit of the fugitive. Behind, their tongues already lolling out, ran the wolf women in great leaping strides. The swine folk followed, squealing with excitement, and the 2 bull men in their swathings of white. Then came Moreau, in a cluster of the beast people, his wide-brimmed straw hat blown off, his revolver in hand and his lank white hair streaming out. The hyena swine ran beside me, keeping pace with me and glancing furtively at me out of his feline eyes, and the others came pattering and shouting behind us. The leopard man went bursting his way through the long canes, which sprang back as he passed, and rattled in Emling's face. We others in the rear found a trampled path for us when we reached the break. The chase lay through the brake for perhaps a quarter of a mile and then plunged into a dense thicket, which retarded our movements exceedingly, though we went through it in a crowd together, fronds flicking into our faces, ropey creepers catching us under the chin or gripping our ankles, thorny plants hooking into and tearing cloth and flesh together.
"He has gone on all fours through this,"
panted Moreau, now just ahead of me.
"None escape,"
said the wolf bear, laughing into my face with the exultation of hunting. We burst out again among the rocks and saw the quarry ahead, running lightly on all fours and snarling at us over his shoulder. At that, the wolf folk howled with delight. The thing was still clothed, and at a distance its face still seemed human, but the carriage of its 4 limbs was feline, and the furtive droop of its shoulder was distinctively that of a hunted animal. It leapt over some thorny yellow flowering bushes and was hidden. Emling was halfway across the space. Most of us now had lost the first speed of the chase and had fallen into a longer and steadier stride. I saw as we traversed the open that the pursuit was now spreading from a column into a line. The hyena swine still ran close to me, watching me as it ran, every now and then puckering its muzzle with a snarling laugh. At the edge of the rocks, the leopard man, realizing that he was making for the projecting cape upon which he had stalked me on the night of my arrival, had doubled in the undergrowth. But Montgomery had seen the manoeuvre and turned him again. So, panting, tumbling against rocks, torn by brambles, impeded by ferns and reeds, I helped to pursue the leopard man who had broken the law, and the hyena swine ran, laughing savagely, by my side. I staggered on, my head reeling and my heart beating against my ribs, tired almost to death and yet not daring to lose sight of the chase, lest I should be left alone with this horrible companion. I staggered on in spite of infinite fatigue and the dense heat of the tropical afternoon. At last, the fury of the hunt slackened. We had pinned the wretched brute into a corner of the island. Moreau, whip in hand, marshalled us all into an irregular line, and we advanced now slowly, shouting to one another as we advanced and tightening the cordon about our victim. He lurked, noiseless and invisible in the bushes, through which I had run from him during that midnight pursuit.
"Steady!" cried Moreau. "Steady!" as the ends of the line crept round the tangle of undergrowth and hemmed the brute in. "What a rush!" came the voice of Montgomery from behind the thicket. I was on the slope above the bushes. Montgomery and Moreau beat along the beach beneath. Slowly we pushed in among the fretted network of branches and leaves. The quarry was silent. "Back to the House of Pain! The House of Pain! The House of Pain!"
Yepped the voice of the ape man some 20 yards to the right. When I heard that, I forgave the poor wretch all the fear he had inspired in me. I heard the twigs snap and the boughs swish aside before the heavy tread of the horse rhinoceros upon my right. Then, suddenly through a polygon of green in the half-darkness under the luxuriant growth, I saw the creature we were hunting. I halted. He was crouched together into the smallest possible compass, his luminous green eyes turned over his shoulder regarding me. It may seem a strange contradiction in me, I cannot explain the fact, but now, seeing the creature there in a perfectly animal attitude, with the light gleaming in its eyes and its imperfectly human face distorted with terror, I realized again the fact of its humanity. In another moment, other of its pursuers would see it, and it would be overpowered and captured, to experience once more the horrible tortures of the enclosure. Abruptly, I slipped out my revolver, aimed between its terror-struck eyes, and fired. As I did so, the hyena swine saw the thing and flung itself upon it with an eager cry, thrusting thirsty teeth into its neck. All about me the green masses of the thicket were swaying and cracking as the beast people came rushing together. One face, then another appeared.
"Don't kill it, Prendick!"
cried Moreau. "Don't kill it!" And I saw him stooping as he pushed under the fronds of the big ferns. In another moment he had beaten off the hyena swine with the handle of his whip, and he and Montgomery were keeping away the exciting carnivorous beast people, and particularly Emling, from the still quivering body. The hairy grey thing came sniffing at the corpse under my arm. The other animals in their animal ardour jostled me to get a nearer view.
"Confound you, Prendick," said Moreau. "I wanted him."
"I'm sorry," said I, though I was not. It was the impulse of the moment. I felt sick with exertion and excitement. Turning, I pushed my way out of the crowding beast people and went on alone up the slope towards the higher part of the headland. Under the shouted directions of Moreau, I heard the 3 white-swathed bullmen begin dragging the victim down towards the water. It was easy now for me to be alone. The beast people manifested a quite human curiosity about the dead body and followed it in a thick knot, sniffing and growling at it as the bullmen dragged it down to the beach. I went to the headland and watched the bullmen, black against the evening sky, as they carried the weighted dead body out to sea, and like a wave across my mind came the realization of the unspeakable aimlessness of things upon the island. Upon the beach among the rocks beneath me were the ape man, the hyena swine, and several other of the beast people, standing about Montgomery and Moreau. They were all still intensely excited, and all overflowing with noisy expressions of their loyalty to the law, yet I felt an absolute assurance in my own mind that the hyena swine was implicated in the rabbit killing. A strange persuasion came upon me that, save for the grossness of the line, the grotesqueness of the forms, I had here before me the whole balance of human life in miniature, the whole interplay of instinct, reason, and fate in its simplest form. The leopard man had happened to go under. That was all the difference. Poor brute. Poor brutes. I began to see the viler aspect of Moreau's cruelty. I had not thought before of the pain and trouble that came to these poor victims after they had passed from Moreau's hands. I had shivered only at the days of actual torment in the enclosure, but now that seemed to me the lesser part. Before they had been beasts, their instincts fitly adapted to their surroundings and happy as living things may be. Now they stumbled in the shackles of humanity, lived in a fear that never died, fretted by a law that they could not understand. Their mock-human existence, begun in an agony, was one long internal struggle, one long dread of Moreau, and for what? It was the wantonness of it that stirred me. Had Moreau had any intelligible object, I could have sympathized at least a little with him. I am not so squeamish about pain as that. I could have forgiven him a little even, had his motive only been hate. But he was so irresponsible, so utterly careless. His curiosity, his mad, aimless investigations drove him on, and the things were thrown out to live a year or so, to struggle and blunder and suffer, and at last to die painfully. They were wretched in themselves. The old animal hate moved them to trouble one another. The law held them back from a brief, hot struggle and a decisive end to their natural animosities. In those days my fear of the beast people went the way of my personal fear for Moreau. I fell indeed into a morbid state, deep and enduring and alien to fear which has left permanent scars upon my mind. I must confess that I lost faith in the sanity of the world when I saw it suffering the painful disorder of this island. A blind fate, a vast, pitiless mechanism seemed to cut and shape the fabric of existence, and I, Moreau by his passion for research, Montgomery by his passion for drink, the beast people with their instincts and mental restrictions were torn and crushed ruthlessly, inevitably amid the infinite complexity of its incessant wheels. But this condition did not come all at once. I think, indeed, that I anticipate a little in speaking of it now. Chapter 17. A Catastrophe. Scarcely 6 weeks passed before I had lost every feeling but dislike and abhorrence for this infamous experiment of Moreau's. My one idea was to get away from these horrible caricatures of my Maker's image, back to the sweet and wholesome intercourse of men. My fellow creatures, from whom I was thus separated, began to assume idyllic virtue and beauty in my memory. My first friendship with Montgomery did not increase. His long separation from humanity, his secret vice of drunkenness, his evident sympathy with the beast people tainted him to me. Several times I let him go alone among them. I avoided intercourse with them in every possible way. I spent an increasing proportion of my time upon the beach, looking for some liberating sail that never appeared, until one day there fell upon us an appalling disaster, which put an altogether different aspect upon my strange surroundings. It was about 7 or 8 weeks after my landing, rather more, I think, though I have not troubled to keep account of the time, when this catastrophe occurred. It happened in the early morning, I should think about 6. I had risen and breakfasted early, having been aroused by the noise of 3 beastmen carrying wood into the enclosure. After breakfast I went to the open gateway of the enclosure and stood there smoking a cigarette and enjoying the freshness of the early morning. Moreau presently came round the corner of the enclosure and greeted me. He passed by me, and I heard him behind me unlock and enter his laboratory. So indurated was I at the time to the abomination of the place that I heard without a touch of emotion the puma victim begin another day of torture. It met its persecutor with a shriek, almost exactly like that of an angry virago. Then, suddenly, something happened. I do not know what to this day. I heard a short, sharp cry behind me, a fall, and, turning, saw an awful face rushing upon me. Not human, not animal, but hellish, brown, seamed with red branching scars, red drops starting out upon it, and the lidless eyes ablaze. I threw my arm up to defend myself from the blow that flung me headlong with a broken forearm, and the great monster, swathed in lint and with red-stained bandages fluttering about it, leapt over me and passed. I rolled over and over down the beach, tried to sit up and collapsed upon my broken arm. Then Moreau appeared, his massive white face all the more terrible for the blood that trickled from his forehead. He carried a revolver in one hand. He scarcely glanced at me, but rushed off at once in pursuit of the puma. I tried the other arm and sat up. The muffled figure in front ran in great striding leaps across the beach, and Moreau followed her. She turned her head and saw him, then, doubling abruptly, made for the bushes. She gained upon him at every stride. I saw her plunge into them, and Moreau, running slantingly to intercept her, fired and missed as she disappeared. Then he, too, vanished in the green confusion. I stared after them, and then the pain in my arm flamed up, and with a groan I staggered to my feet. Montgomery appeared in the doorway, dressed and with revolver in his hand.
"Great God, Prendick,"
he said, not noticing that I was hurt.
"That brute's loose. Tore the fetter out of the wall. Have you seen them?"
Then, sharply seeing I gripped my arm.
"What's the matter?"
"I was standing in the doorway," said I. He came forward and took my arm.
"Blood on the sleeve,"
said he, and rolled back the flannel. He pocketed his weapon, felt my arm about painfully, and led me inside.
"Your arm is broken," he said.
And then,
"Tell me exactly how it happened." "What happened?"
I told him what I had seen, told him in broken sentences with gasps of pain between them, and very dexterously and swiftly he bound my arm meanwhile. He slung it from my shoulder, stood back and looked at me.
"You'll do,"
he said.
"And now?"
he thought. Then he went out and locked the gates of the enclosure. He was absent some time. I was chiefly concerned about my arm. The incident seemed merely one more of many horrible things. I sat down in the deck chair, and I must admit swore heartily at the ident. The first dull feeling of injury in my arm had already given way to a burning pain when Montgomery reappeared. His face was rather pale, and he showed more of his lower gums than ever.
"I can neither see nor hear anything of him," he said. "I've been thinking he may want my help."
He stared at me with his expressionless eyes.
"That was a strong brute," he said. "It simply wrenched its fetter out of the wall."
He went to the window, then to the door, and there turned to me.
"I shall go after him," he said. "There's another revolver I can leave with you. To tell you the truth, I feel anxious somehow."
He obtained the weapon and put it ready to my hand on the table, then went out, leaving a restless contagion in the air. I did not sit long after he left, but took the revolver in hand and went to the doorway. The morning was as still as death. Not a whisper of wind was stirring. The sea was like polished glass, the sky empty, the beach desolate. In my half-excited, half-feverish state, this stillness of things oppressed me. I tried to whistle and the tune died away. I swore again. The second time that morning. Then I went to the corner of the enclosure and stared inland at that green bush that had swallowed up Moreau and Montgomery. When would they return, and how? Then, far away up the beach, a little grey beast man appeared, ran down to the water's edge and began splashing about. I strolled back to the doorway, then to the corner again, and so began pacing to and fro like a sentinel upon duty. Once I was arrested by the distant voice of Montgomery, bawling, "Curry! Moreau!" My arm became less painful, but very hot. I got feverish and thirsty. My shadow grew shorter. I watched the distant figure until it went away again. Would Moreau and Montgomery never return? 3 seabirds began fighting for some stranded treasure. Then, from far away behind the enclosure, I heard a pistol shot. A long silence. And then came another. Then a yelling cry nearer and another dismal gap of silence. My unfortunate imagination set to work to torment me. Then suddenly a shot close by. I went to the corner, startled, and saw Montgomery, his face scarlet, his hair disordered, and the knee of his trousers torn. His face expressed profound consternation. Behind him slouched the beastman Emling, and round Emling's jaws were some queer dark stains.
"Has he come?"
said Montgomery. "Moreau," said I. "No."
"My God!"
The man was panting, almost sobbing.
"Go back in,"
he said, taking my arm.
"They're mad. They're all rushing about mad. What can have happened? Oh, I don't know. I'll tell you when my breath comes. Where's some brandy?"
Montgomery limped before me into the room and sat down in the deck chair. Emling flung himself down just outside the doorway and began panting like a dog. I got Montgomery some brandy and water. He sat staring in front of him at nothing, recovering his breath. After some minutes, he began to tell me what had happened. He had followed their track for some way. It was plain enough at first on account of the crushed and broken bushes, white rags torn from the puma's bandages, and occasional smears of blood on the leaves of shrubs and undergrowth. He lost the track, however, on the stony ground beyond the stream, where I had seen the beast man drinking, and went wandering aimlessly westward, shouting Moreau's name. Then Emling had come to him carrying a light hatchet. Emling had seen nothing of the puma affair, had been felling wood, and heard him calling. They went on, shouting together. 2 beastmen came, crouching and peering at them through the undergrowth with gestures and a furtive carriage that alarmed Montgomery by their strangeness. He hailed them, and they fled, guiltily. He stopped shouting after that, and after wandering some time farther in an undecided way, determined to visit the huts. He found the ravine deserted. Growing more alarmed every minute, he began to retrace his steps. Then it was he who encountered the 2 swine men I had seen dancing on the night of my arrival. Blood-stained they were about the mouth and intensely excited. They came crashing through the ferns and stopped with fierce faces when they saw him. He cracked his whip in some trepidation, and forthwith they rushed at him. Never before had a beast man dared to do that. One he shot through the head. Emling flung himself upon the other, and the 2 rolled, grappling. Emling got his brute under and with his teeth in its throat, and Montgomery shot that too as it struggled in Emling's grip. He had some difficulty in inducing Emling to come on with him. Thence they had hurried back to me. On the way, Emling had suddenly rushed into a thicket and driven out an undersized ocelot man, also blood-stained and lame through a wound in the foot. The brute had run a little way and then turned savagely at bay, and Montgomery, with a certain wantonness, I thought, had shot him. "What does it all mean?" said I. He shook his head and turned once more to the brandy. Chapter 18. The Finding of Moreau. When I saw Montgomery swallow a 3rd dose of brandy, I took it upon myself to interfere. He was already more than half fuddled. I told him that some serious thing must have happened to Moreau by this time, or he would have returned before this, and that it behooved us to ascertain what that catastrophe was. Montgomery raised some feeble objections and at last agreed. We had some food, and then all 3 of us started. It is possibly due to the tension of my mind at the time, but even now that start into the hot stillness of the tropical afternoon is a singularly vivid impression. Emling went first. His shoulder hunched, his strange black head moving with quick starts as he peered first on this side of the way and then on that. He was unarmed. His axe he had dropped when he encountered the swine men. Teeth were his weapons when it came to fighting. Montgomery followed with stumbling footsteps, his hands in his pockets, his face downcast. He was in a state of muddled sullenness, with me on account of the brandy. My left arm was in a sling. It was lucky it was my left, and I carried my revolver in my right. Soon we traced a narrow path through the wide luxuriance of the island, going northwestward, and presently Emling stopped and became rigid with watchfulness. Montgomery almost staggered into him and then stopped too. Then, listening intently, we heard, coming through the trees, the sound of voices and footsteps approaching us.
"He is dead,"
said a deep, vibrating voice.
"He is not dead, he is not dead,"
jabbered another.
We saw,
said several voices.
"Hello!"
Suddenly shouted Montgomery.
"Hello there!"
"Confound you!" said I, and gripped my pistol. There was a silence, then a crashing among the interlacing vegetation, first here and there, and then half a dozen faces appeared, strange faces lit by a strange light. Emling made a growling noise in his throat. I recognized the ape man. I had indeed already identified his voice and two of the white-swathed, brown-featured creatures I had seen in Montgomery's boat. With these were the two dappled brutes, and that grey, horribly crooked creature who said the law, with grey hair streaming down its cheeks, heavy grey eyebrows and grey locks pouring off from a central parting upon its sloping forehead. A heavy, faceless thing with strange red eyes, looking at us curiously from amidst the green. For a space, no one spoke. Then Montgomery hiccuped.
"Who said he was dead?"
The monkey man looked guiltily at the hairy grey thing.
"He is dead,"
said this monster.
"They saw."
There was nothing threatening about this detachment at any rate. They seemed awe-stricken and puzzled.
"Where is he?"
said Montgomery. "Beyond," and the grey creature pointed.
"Is there a law now?"
asked the monkey man.
"Is it still to be this and that? Is he dead indeed?"
"Is there a law?" repeated the man in white. "Is there a law, thou other with the whip?" "He is dead," said the hairy grey thing, and they all stood watching us.
"Prendick,"
said Montgomery, turning his dull eyes to me.
"He's dead, evidently."
I had been standing behind him during this colloquy. I began to see how things lay with them. I suddenly stepped in front of Montgomery and lifted up my voice. "Children of the law," I said, "he is not dead." Emling turned his sharp eyes on me. "He has changed his shape. He has changed his body," I went on. "For a time you will not see him. He is there." I pointed upward. "Where he can watch you. You cannot see him, but he can see you. Fear the law." I looked at them squarely. They flinched.
"He is great, he is good,"
said the ape man, peering fearfully upward among the dense trees. "And the other thing?" I demanded. "The thing that bled and ran screaming and sobbing, that is dead too," said the grey thing, still regarding me.
"That's well,"
grunted Montgomery. "The other, with the whip," began the grey thing. "Well," said I. "Said he was dead." But Montgomery was still sober enough to understand my motive in denying Moreau's death.
"He's not dead," he said slowly. "Not dead at all. No more dead than I am."
"Some," said I, "have broken the law. They will die. Some have died. Show us now where his old body lies, the body he cast away because he had no more need of it." "It is this way, man who walked in the sea," said the grey thing. And with these 6 creatures guiding us, we went through the tumult of ferns and creepers and tree stems towards the northwest. Then came a yelling, a crashing among the branches, and a little pink homunculus rushed by us shrieking. Immediately after appeared a monster in headlong pursuit, blood bedabbled, who was amongst us before he would stop his career. The grey thing leapt aside. Emling, with a snarl, flew at it and was struck aside. Montgomery fired and missed, bowed his head, threw up his arm and turned to run. I fired, and the thing still came on. Fired again, point blank into its ugly face. I saw its features vanish in a flash. Its face was driven in. Yet it passed me, gripped Montgomery, and holding him, fell headlong beside him and pulled him sprawling upon itself in its death agony. I found myself alone with Emling, the dead brute, and the prostrate man. Montgomery raised himself slowly and stared in a muddled way at the shattered beast man beside him. It more than half sobered him. He scrambled to his feet. Then I saw the grey thing returning cautiously through the trees. "See," said I, pointing to the dead brute. "Is the law not alive? This came of breaking the law." He peered at the body. "He sends the fire that kills," said he, in his deep voice repeating part of the ritual. The others gathered round and stared for a space. At last we drew near the westward extremity of the island. We came upon the gnawed and mutilated body of the puma, its shoulder bones smashed by a bullet, and perhaps 20 yards farther found at last what we sought. Moreau lay face downward in a trampled space in a canebrake. One hand was almost severed at the wrist, and his silvery hair was dabbled in blood. His head had been battered in by the fetters of the puma. The broken canes beneath him were smeared with blood. His revolver we could not find. Montgomery turned him over, resting at intervals, and with the help of 7 beast people, for he was a heavy man, we carried Moreau back to the enclosure. The night was darkling. Twice we heard unseen creatures howling and shrieking past our little band, and once the little pink sloth creature appeared and stared at us and vanished again. But we were not attacked again. At the gates of the enclosure, our company of beast people left us, Emling going with the rest. We locked ourselves in, and then took Moreau's mangled body into the yard and laid it upon a pile of brushwood. Then we went into the laboratory and put an end to all we found living there. Chapter 19. Montgomery's Bank Holiday. When this was accomplished, and we had washed and eaten, Montgomery and I went into my little room and seriously discussed our position for the first time. It was then near midnight. He was almost sober, but greatly disturbed in his mind. He had been strangely under the influence of Moreau's personality. I do not think it had ever occurred to him that Moreau could die. This disaster was the sudden collapse of the habits that had become part of his nature in the 10 or more monotonous years he had spent on the island. He talked vaguely, answered my questions crookedly, wandered into general questions.
"This silly ass of a world," he said. "What a muddle it all is. I haven't had any life. I wonder when it's going to begin. 16 years being bullied by nurses and schoolmasters at their own sweet will. 5 in London, grinding hard at medicine, bad food, shabby lodgings, shabby clothes, shabby vice. A blunder. I didn't know any better, and hustled off to this beastly island. 10 years here. What's it all for, Prendick? Are we bubbles blown by a baby?"
It was hard to deal with such ravings. "The thing we have to think of now," said I, "is how to get away from this island."
"What's the good of getting away? I'm an outcast. Where am I to join on? It's all very well for you, Prendick. Poor old Moreau. We can't leave him here to have his bones picked as it is. And besides, what will become of the decent part of the beast folk?"
"Well," said I, "that will do tomorrow. I've been thinking we might make the brushwood into a pyre and burn his body, and those other things. Then what will happen with the beast folk?"
"I don't know. I suppose those that were made of beasts of prey will make silly asses of themselves sooner or later. We can't massacre the lot, can we? I suppose that's what your humanity would suggest, but they'll change. They are sure to change."
He talked thus inconclusively until at last I felt my temper going.
"Damnation!" he exclaimed at some petulance of mine. "Can't you see I'm in a worse hole than you are?"
And he got up and went for the brandy.
"Drink," he said, returning. You logic-chopping, chalky-faced saint of an atheist. Drink!
Not I, said I, and sat grimly watching his face under the yellow paraffin flare as he drank himself into a garrulous misery. I have a memory of infinite tedium. He wandered into a maudlin defence of the Beast People and of Emling. Emling, he said, was the only thing that had ever really cared for him, and suddenly an idea came to him.
I'm damned, said he, staggering to his feet and clutching the brandy bottle.
By some flash of intuition, I knew what it was he intended. You don't give drink to that beast, I said, rising and facing him.
Beast, said he. You're the beast. He takes liquor like a Christian. Come out of the way, Prendick.
For God's sake, said I.
Get out of the way,
he roared, and suddenly whipped out his revolver. Very well, said I, and stood aside, half-minded to fall upon him as he put his hand upon the latch, but deterred by the thought of my useless arm. You've made a beast of yourself. To the beasts you may go. He flung the doorway open and stood half-facing me between the yellow lamplight and the pallid glare of the moon. His eye sockets were blotches of black under his stubbly eyebrows.
You're a solemn prig, Prendick, a silly ass. You are always fearing and fancying. We're on the edge of things. I'm bound to cut my throat tomorrow. I'm going to have a damn bank holiday tonight.
He turned and went out into the moonlight.
Emling, he cried. Emling, old friend.
3 dim creatures in the silvery light came along the edge of the one beach. One, a white-wrapped creature, the other 2 blotches of blackness following it. They halted, staring. Then I saw Emling's hunched shoulders as he came round the corner of the house.
Drink, cried Montgomery. Drink, you brutes. Drink and be men. Damn, I'm the cleverest. Moreau forgot this. This is the last touch. Drink, I tell you.
And, waving the bottle in his hand, he started off at a kind of quick trot to the westward, Emling ranging himself between him and the 3 dim creatures who followed. I went to the doorway. They were already indistinct in the mist of the moonlight before Montgomery halted. I saw him administer a dose of the raw brandy to Emling and saw the 5 figures melt into one vague patch.
Sing!
I heard Montgomery shout.
Sing all together, confound old Prendick. That's right, now again. Confound old Prendick.
The black group broke up into 5 separate figures and wound slowly away from me along the band of shining beach. Each went howling at his own sweet will, yelping insults at me or giving whatever other vent this new inspiration of brandy demanded. Presently I heard Montgomery's voice shouting, "Right turn!" and they passed with their shouts and howls into the blackness of the landward trees. Slowly, very slowly, they receded into silence. The peaceful splendour of the night healed again. The moon was now past the meridian and travelling down the west. It was at its full, and very bright riding through the empty blue sky. The shadow of the wall lay, a yard wide and of inky blackness at my feet. The eastward sea was a featureless grey, dark and mysterious, and between the sea and the shadow the grey sands, the volcanic glass and crystals, flashed and shone like a beach of diamonds. Behind me the paraffin lamp flared hot and ruddy. Then I shut the door, locked it, and went into the enclosure where Moreau lay beside his latest victims, the staghounds and the llama and some other wretched brutes, with his massive face calm even after his terrible death, and with the hard eyes open staring at the dead white moon above. I sat down upon the edge of the sink, and with my eyes upon that ghastly pile of silvery light and ominous shadows began to turn over my palms. In the morning I would gather some provisions in the dinghy, and after setting fire to the pyre before me, push out into the desolation of the high sea once more. I felt that for Montgomery there was no help, that he was, in truth, half akin to these beast folk, unfitted for human kindred. I do not know how long I sat there scheming. Must have been an hour or so. Then my planning was interrupted by the return of Montgomery to my neighbourhood. I heard a yelling from many throats, a tumult of exultant cries passing down toward the beach, whooping and howling, and exciting shrieks that seemed to come to a stop near the water's edge. The riot rose and fell. I heard heavy blows and the splintering smash of wood, but it did not trouble me then. Discordant chanting began. My thoughts went back to my means of escape. I got up, brought the lamp, and went into a shed to look at some kegs I had seen there. Then I became interested in the contents of some biscuit tins and opened one. I saw something out of the tail of my eye, a red figure, and turned sharply. Behind me lay the yard, vividly black and white in the moonlight, and the pile of wood and faggots on which Moreau and his mutilated victims lay one over another. They seemed to be gripping one another in the last revengeful grapple. His wounds gaped, black as night, and the blood that had dripped lay in black patches upon the sand. Then I saw, without understanding the cause of my phantom, a ruddy glow that came and danced and went upon the wall opposite. I misinterpreted this, fancied it was a reflection of my flickering lamp, and turned again to the stores in the shed. I went on rummaging among them, as well as a one-armed man could, finding this convenient thing and that, and putting them aside for tomorrow's launch. My movements were slow, and the time passed quickly. Insensibly, the daylight crept up upon me. The chanting died down, giving place to a clamour. Then it began again, and suddenly broke into a tumult. I heard cries of, "More! More!" a sound like quarrelling, and a sudden wild shriek. The quality of the sounds changed so greatly that it arrested my attention. I went out into the yard and listened. Then, cutting like a knife across the confusion, came the crack of a revolver. I rushed at once through my room to the little doorway. As I did so, I heard some of the packing cases behind me go sliding down and smash together with a clatter of glass on the floor of the shed, but I did not heed these. I flung the door open and looked out. Up the beach, by the boathouse, a bonfire was burning, raining up sparks into the indistinctness of the dawn. Around this struggled a mass of black figures. I heard Montgomery call my name. I began to run at once towards this fire, revolver in hand. I saw the pink tongue of Montgomery's pistol lick out once close to the ground. He was down. I shouted with all my strength and fired into the air. I heard someone cry, "The master!" The knotted black struggle broke into scattering units. The fire leapt and sank down. The crowd of beast people fled in sudden panic before me up the beach. In my excitement, I fired at their retreating backs as they disappeared among the bushes. Then I turned to the black heaps upon the ground. Montgomery lay on his back, with the hairy grey beast man sprawling across his body. The brute was dead, but still gripping Montgomery's throat with its curving claws. Nearby lay Emling on his face and quite still, his neck bitten open, and the upper part of the smashed brandy bottle in his hand. 2 other figures lay near the fire, the one motionless, the other groaning fitfully, every now and then raising its head slowly and then dropping it again. I caught hold of the grey man and pulled him off Montgomery's body. His claws drew down the torn coat reluctantly as I dragged him away. Montgomery was dark in the face and scarcely breathing. I splashed seawater on his face and pillowed his head on my rolled-up coat. Emling was dead. The wounded creature by the fire, it was a wolf brute with a bearded grey face, lay, I found, with the forepart of its body upon the still glowing timber. The wretched thing was injured so dreadfully that in mercy I blew its brains out at once. The other brute was one of the bullmen, swathed in white. He too was dead. The rest of the beast people had vanished from the beach. I went to Montgomery again and knelt beside him, cursing my ignorance of medicine. The fire beside me had sunk down, and only charred beams of timber glowing at the central ends and mixed with the grey ash of brushwood remained. I wondered casually where Montgomery had got his wood. Then I saw that the dawn was upon us. The sky had grown brighter. The setting moon was becoming pale and opaque in the luminous blue of the sky. The sky to the eastward was rimmed with red. Suddenly I heard a thud and a hissing behind me, and, looking round, sprang to my feet with a cry of horror. Against the warm dawn, great tumultuous masses of black smoke were boiling up out of the enclosure, and through their stormy darkness shot flickering threads of blood-red flame. Then the thatched roof caught. I saw the curving charge of the flames across the sloping straw. A spurt of fire jetted from the window of my room. I knew at once what had happened. I remembered the crash I had heard when I had rushed out to Montgomery's assistance. I had overturned the lamp. The hopelessness of saving any of the contents of the enclosure stared me in the face. My mind came back to my plan of flight, and turning swiftly, I looked to see where 2 boats lay upon the beach. They were gone. 2 axes lay upon the sands beside me. Chips and splinters were scattered broadcast, and the ashes of the bonfire were blackening and smoking under the dawn. Montgomery had burnt the boats to revenge himself upon me and prevent our return to mankind. A sudden convulsion of rage shook me. I was almost moved to batter his foolish head in as he lay there helpless at my feet. Then suddenly his hand moved so feebly, so pitifully that my wrath vanished. He groaned and opened his eyes for a minute. I knelt down beside him and raised his head. He opened his eyes again, staring silently at the dawn, and then they met mine. The lids fell.
"Sorry,"
he said presently, with an effort. He seemed trying to think.
"The last," he murmured. "The last of the silly universe. What a mess."
I listened. His head fell helplessly to one side. I thought some drink might revive him, but there was neither drink nor vessel in which to bring drink at hand. He seemed suddenly heavier. My heart went cold. I bent down to his face, put my hand through the rent in his blouse. He was dead. And even as he died, a line of white heat, the limb of the sun, rose eastward beyond the projection of the bay, splashing its radiance across the sky and turning the dark sea into a weltering tumult of dazzling light. It fell like a glory upon his death-shrunken face. I let his head fall gently upon the rough pillow I had made for him and stood up. Before me was the glittering desolation of the sea, the awful solitude upon which I had already suffered so much. Behind me, the island, hushed under the dawn, its beast people silent and unseen. The enclosure with all its provisions and ammunition burnt noisily, with sudden gusts of flame, a fitful crackling and now and then a crash. The heavy smoke drove up the beach away from me, rolling low over the distant tree-tops towards the huts in the ravine. Beside me were the charred vestiges of the boats, and these 5 dead bodies. Then, out of the bushes came 3 beast people, with hunched shoulders, protruding heads, misshapen hands awkwardly held, and inquisitive, unfriendly eyes, and advanced towards me with hesitating gestures. Chapter 20. Alone with the Beast Folk. I faced these people, facing my fate in them, single-handed now, literally single-handed, for I had a broken arm. In my pocket was a revolver with 2 empty chambers. Among the chips scattered about the beach lay the 2 axes that had been used to chop up the boats. The tide was creeping in behind me. There was nothing for it but courage. I looked squarely into the faces of the advancing monsters. They avoided my eyes, and their quivering nostrils investigated the bodies that lay beyond me on the beach. I took 6 steps, picked up the blood-stained whip that lay beneath the body of the wolf-man and cracked it. They stopped and stared at me. "Salute," said I. "Bow down." They hesitated. One bent his knees. I repeated my command with my heart in my mouth and advanced upon them. One knelt, then the other 2. I turned and walked towards the dead bodies, keeping my face towards the 3 kneeling beast men, very much as an actor passing up the stage faces the audience. "They broke the law," said I, putting my foot on the sayer of the law. "They have been slain, even the sayer of the law, even the other with the whip. Great is the law. Come and see." "None escape," said one of them, advancing and peering. "None escape," said I. "Therefore hear and do as I command." They stood up, looking questioningly at one another. "Stand there," said I. I picked up the hatchets and swung them by their heads from the sling of my arm, turned Montgomery over, picked up his revolver still loaded in 2 chambers, and bending down to rummage found 6 cartridges in his pocket. "Take him," said I, standing up again and pointing with the whip. "Take him and carry him out and cast him into the sea." They came forward, evidently still afraid of Montgomery, but still more afraid of my cracking red whiplash, and after some fumbling and hesitation, some whip-cracking and shouting, they lifted him gingerly, carried him down the beach, and went splashing into the dazzling welter of the sea. "On," said I, "on, carry him far." They went in up to their armpits and stood regarding me. "Let go," said I, and the body of Montgomery vanished with a splash. Something seemed to tighten across my chest. "Good," said I with a break in my voice, and they came back, hurrying and fearful to the margin of the water, leaving long wakes of black in the silver. At the water's edge they stopped, turning and glaring into the sea as though they presently expected Montgomery to arise therefrom and exact vengeance. "Now, these," said I, pointing to the other bodies. They took care not to approach the place where they had thrown Montgomery into the water, but instead carried the 4 dead beast people slantingly along the beach for perhaps 100 yards before they waded out and cast them away. As I watched them disposing of the mangled remains of Emling, I heard a light footfall behind me, and, turning quickly, saw the big hyena swine perhaps 12 yards away. His head was bent down, his bright eyes were fixed upon me, his stumpy hands clenched and held close by his side. He stopped in this crouching attitude when I turned, his eyes a little averted. For a moment we stood, eye to eye. I dropped the whip and snatched at the pistol in my pocket, for I meant to kill this brute, the most formidable of any now left on the island, at the first excuse. It may seem treacherous, but so I was resolved. I was far more afraid of him than any other 2 of the beast folk. His continued life was, I knew, a threat against mine. I was perhaps 12 seconds collecting myself, then cried I, "Salute! Bow down!" His teeth flashed upon me in a snarl.
"Who are you that I should—"
Perhaps a little too spasmodically I drew my revolver, aimed quickly and fired. I heard him yelp, saw him run sideways and turn, knew I had missed and clicked back the cock with my thumb for the next shot, but he was already running, headlong, jumping from side to side, and I dare not risk another miss. Every now and then he looked back at me over his shoulder. He went slanting along the beach and vanished beneath the driving masses of dense smoke that was still pouring out from the burning enclosure. For some time I stood staring after him. I turned to my 3 obedient beast folk again and signalled them to drop the body they still carried. Then I went back to the place by the fire where the bodies had fallen and kicked the sand until all the brown stains were absorbed and hidden. I dismissed my 3 serfs with a wave of the hand and went up the beach into the thickets. I carried my pistol in my hand and my whip thrust with the hatchets in the sling of my arm. I was anxious to be alone, to think out the position in which I was now placed. A dreadful thing that I was only beginning to realize was that over all this island there was now no safe place where I could be alone and secure to rest or sleep. I had recovered strength amazingly since my landing, but I was still inclined to be nervous and to break down under any great stress. I felt that I ought to cross the island and establish myself with the beast people and make myself secure in their confidence, but my heart failed me. I went back to the beach, and turning eastward past the burning enclosure, made for a point where a shallow spit of coral sand ran out towards the reef. Here I could sit down and think, my back to the sea and my face against any surprise, and there I sat, chin on knees, the sun beating down upon my head and unspeakable dread in my mind, plotting how I could live on against the hour of my rescue, if ever rescue came. I tried to review the whole situation as calmly as I could, but it was difficult to clear the thing of emotion. I began turning over in my mind the reason of Montgomery's despair.
"They will change," he said. "They are sure to change."
And Moreau. What was it that Moreau had said?
"The stubborn beast flesh grows day by day back again."
Then I came round to the hyena swine. I felt sure that if I did not kill that brute, he would kill me. The sayer of the law was dead, worse luck. They knew now that we of the whips could be killed, even as they themselves were killed. Were they peering at me already out of the green masses of ferns and palms over yonder, watching until I came within their spring? Were they plotting against me? What was the heinous swine telling them? My imagination was running away with me into a morass of unsubstantial fears. My thoughts were disturbed by a crying of seabirds hurrying towards some black object that had been stranded by the waves on the beach near the enclosure. I knew what that object was, but I had not the heart to go back and drive them off. I began walking along the beach in the opposite direction, designing to come round the eastward corner of the island and so approach the ravine of the huts without traversing the possible ambuscades of the thickets. Perhaps half a mile along the beach I became aware of one of my 3 beast folk advancing out of the landward bushes towards me. I was now so nervous with my own imaginings that I immediately drew my revolver. Even the propitiatory gestures of the creature failed to disarm me. He hesitated as he approached. "Go away!" cried I. There was something very suggestive of a dog in the cringing attitude of the creature. It retreated a little way, very like a dog being sent home, and stopped, looking at me imploringly with canine brown eyes. "Go away," said I. "Do not come near me."
"May I not come near you?"
it said. "No, go away," I insisted and snapped my whip. Then, putting the whip in my teeth, I stooped for a stone, and with that threat drove the creature away. So in solitude I came round by the ravine of the beast people, and hiding among the weeds and reeds that separated this crevice from the sea, I watched such of them as appeared, trying to judge from their gestures the appearance and how the death of Moreau and Montgomery and the destruction of the House of Pain had affected them. I know now the folly of my cowardice. Had I kept my courage up to the level of the dawn, had I not allowed it to ebb away in solitary thought, I might have grasped the vacant sceptre of Moreau and ruled over the beast people. As it was, I lost the opportunity, and sank to the position of a mere leader among my fellows. Towards noon, certain of them came and squatted, basking in the hot sand. The imperious voices of hunger and thirst prevailed over my dread. I came out of the bushes and, revolver in hand, walked down towards the 3 seated figures. One, a wolf-woman, turned her head and stared at me, and then the others. None attempted to rise or salute me. I felt too faint and weary to insist, and I let the moment pass. "I want food," said I, almost apologetically, and drawing near. "There is food in the huts," said an ox-boar man drowsily, and looking away from me. I passed them and went down into the shadow and odours of the almost deserted ravine. In an empty hut I feasted on some specked and half-decayed fruit, and then, after I had propped some branches and sticks about the opening and placed myself with my face towards it, my hand upon my revolver, the exhaustion of the last 30 hours claimed its own, and I fell into a light slumber, hoping that the flimsy barricade I had erected would cause sufficient noise in its removal to save me from surprise. Chapter 21. The Reversion of the Beast Folk. In this way I became one among the beast people in the island of Dr. Moreau. When I awoke, it was dark about me. My arm ached in its bandages. I sat up, wondering at first where I might be. I heard coarse voices talking outside. Then I saw that my barricade had gone, and that the opening of the hut stood clear. My revolver was still in my hand. I heard something breathing, saw something crouched together close beside me. I held my breath to see what it was. It began to move slowly, interminably. Then something soft and warm and moist passed across my hand. All of my muscles contracted. I snatched my hand away. A cry of alarm began and was stifled in my throat. Then I just realized what had happened sufficiently to stay my fingers on the revolver.
"Who is that?"
I said in a hoarse whisper, the revolver still pointed.
"I? Master."
"Who are you?"
"They say there is no master now, but I know. I carried the bodies into the sea."
"Oh,
Walker in the sea, the bodies of those you slew. I am your slave, master.
Are you the one I met on the beach? I asked.
The same, master.
The thing was evidently faithful enough, for it might have fallen upon me as I slept. It is well, I said, extending my hand for another licking kiss. I began to realize what its presence meant, and the tide of my courage flowed. Where are the others? I asked.
They are mad, they are fools, said the dog man. Even now they talk together beyond there. They say, the master who is dead, the other with the whip is dead, the other who walked into the sea is as we are. We have no master, no whips, no house of pain any more. There is an end. We love the law, and we will keep it, but there is no pain, no master, no whips for ever again. So they say, but I know, master, I know.
I felt in the darkness and patted the dog man's head. It is well, I said again.
Presently you will slay them all,
said the dog man. Presently, I answered, I will slay them all. After certain days and certain things have come to pass, every one of them save those you spare, every one of them shall be slain.
What the master wishes to kill, the master kills, said the dog man,
with a certain satisfaction in his voice. And that their sins may grow, I said. Let them live in their folly until their time is ripe. Let them not know that I am the master.
The master's will is sweet, said the dog man, with the ready tact of his canine blood.
But one has sinned, said I. Him I will kill, whenever I may meet him. When I say to you that is he, see that you fall upon him. And now I will go to the men and women who are assembled together. For a moment the opening of the hut was blackened by the exit of the dog man. Then I followed and stood up, almost in the exact spot where I had been where I'd heard Moreau and the staghound pursuing me. But now it was night, and all the miasmatic ravine about me was black, and beyond, instead of a green sunlit slope, I saw a red fire, before which hunched grotesque figures moved to and fro. Farther were the thick trees, a bank of darkness fringed above with the black lace of the upper branches. The moon was just riding up on the edge of the ravine, and like a bar across its face drove the spire of vapour that was forever streaming from the fumaroles of the island. Walk by me, said I, nerving myself, and side by side we walked down the narrow way, taking little heed of the dim things that peered at us out of the huts. None about the fire attempted to salute me. Most of them disregarded me ostentatiously. I looked round for the hyena swine, but he was not there. Altogether perhaps 20 of the beast folk squatted, staring into the fire or talking to one another.
He is dead, the master is dead, said the voice of the ape man to the right of me. The house of pain, there is no house of pain.
He is not dead, said I, in a loud voice. Even now, he watches us. This startled them. 20 pairs of eyes regarded me. The house of pain is gone, said I. It will come again. The master you cannot see, yet even now he listens among you.
True, said the dog man.
They were staggered at my assurance. An animal may be ferocious and cunning enough, but it takes a real man to tell a lie. The man with the bandaged arm speaks a strange thing, said one of the beast folk. I tell you it is so, said I. The master and the house of pain will come again. Woe be to him who breaks the law. They looked curiously at one another. With an affectation of indifference, I began to chop idly at the ground in front of me with my hatchet. They looked, I noticed, at the deep cuts I made in the turf. Then the satire raised a doubt. I answered him. Then one of the dappled things objected, and an animated discussion sprang up round the fire. Every moment I began to feel more convinced of my present security. I talked now without the catching in my breath, due to the intensity of my excitement that had troubled me at first. In the course of about an hour, I had really convinced several of the beast folk of the truth of my assertions, and talked most of the others into a dubious state. I kept a sharp eye for my enemy, the hyena swine, but he never appeared. Every now and then a suspicious movement would startle me, but my confidence grew rapidly. Then, as the moon crept down from the zenith, one by one the listeners began to yawn, showing the oddest teeth in the light of the sinking fire. And first one, then another retired towards the dens in the ravine, and I, dreading the silence and darkness, went with them, knowing I was safer with several of them than with one alone. In this manner began the longer part of my sojourn upon this island of Dr. Moreau. But from that night until the end came, there was but one thing happened to tell save a series of innumerable small unpleasant details and the fretting of an incessant uneasiness, so that I prefer to make no chronicle for that gap of time, to tell only one cardinal incident of the 10 months I spent as an intimate of these half-humanized brutes. There is much that sticks in my memory that I could write, things I would cheerfully give my right hand to forget, but they do not help the telling of the story. In the retrospect, it is strange to remember how soon I fell in with these monsters' ways and gained my confidence again. I had my quarrels with them, of course, and could show some of their teeth marks still, but they soon gained a wholesome respect for my trick of throwing stones and for the bite of my hatchet. And my St. Bernard man's loyalty was of infinite service to me. I found their simple scale of honour was based mainly on the capacity for inflicting trenchant wounds. Indeed, I may say, without vanity, I hope that I held something like preeminence among them. One or two whom in a rare access of high spirits I had scarred rather badly bore me a grudge, but it vented itself chiefly behind my back and at a safe distance from my missiles, in grimaces. The hyena swine avoided me, and I was always on the alert for him. My inseparable dog-man hated and dreaded him intensely. I really believe that was at the root of the brute's attachment to me. It was soon evident to me that the former monster had tasted blood, and gone the way of the leopard man. He formed a lair somewhere in the forest and became solitary. Once I tried to induce the beast folk to hunt him, but I lacked the authority to make them cooperate for one end. Again and again I tried to approach his den and come upon him unaware, but he was always too acute for me, and saw or winded me and got away. He, too, made every forest pathway dangerous to me and my ally with his lurking ambuscades. The dog-man scarcely dared to leave my side. In the first month or so, the beast folk, compared with their latter condition, were human enough, and for one or two besides my canine friend, I even conceived a friendly tolerance. The little pink sloth creature displayed an odd affection for me and took to following me about. The monkey man bored me, however. He assumed, on the strength of his 5 digits, that he was my equal and was forever jabbering at me, jabbering the most arrant nonsense. One thing about him entertained me a little. He had a fantastic trick of coining new words. I had an idea, I believe, that to gabble about names that meant nothing was the proper use of speech. He called it big thinks to distinguish it from little thinks, the sane, everyday interests of life. If ever I made a remark he did not understand, he would praise it very much, ask me to say it again, learn it by heart, and go off repeating it, with a word wrong here or there, to all the milder of the beast people. He thought nothing of what was plain and comprehensible. I invited some very curious big thinks for his especial use. I think now that he was the silliest creature I ever met. He had developed in the most wonderful way the distinctive silliness of man without losing one jot of the natural folly of a monkey. This, I say, was in the earlier weeks of my solitude among these brutes. During that time they respected the usage established by the law and behaved with general decorum. Once I found another rabbit torn to pieces by the hyena swine, I am assured, but that was all. It was about May when I first distinctly perceived a growing difference in their speech and carriage, a growing coarseness of articulation, a growing disinclination to talk. My monkey man's jabber multiplied in volume, but grew less and less comprehensible, more and more simian. Some of the others seemed altogether slipping their hold upon speech, though they still understood what I said to them at that time. Can you imagine language, once clear-cut and exact, softening and guttering, losing shape and import, becoming mere lumps of sound again? And they walked erect with an increasing difficulty. Though they evidently felt ashamed of themselves, every now and then I would come upon one or another running on toes and fingertips and quite unable to recover the vertical attitude. They held things more clumsily. Drinking by suction, feeding by gnawing, grew commoner every day. I realized more keenly than ever what Moreau had told me about the stubborn beast flesh. They were reverting, and reverting very rapidly. Some of them, The pioneers in this, I noticed with some surprise, were all females, began to disregard the injunction of decency deliberately for the most part. Others even attempted public outrages upon the institution of monogamy. The tradition of the law was clearly losing its force. I cannot pursue this disagreeable subject. My dog man imperceptibly slipped back to the dog again. Day by day he became dumb, quadrupedal, hairy. I scarcely noticed the transition from the companion on my right hand to the lurching dog at my side. As the carelessness and disorganization increased from day to day, the lane of dwelling places, at no time very sweet, became so loathsome that I left it, and, going across the island, made myself a hovel of boughs amid the black ruins of Moreau's enclosure. Some memory of pain, I found, still made that place the safest from the beast folk. It would be impossible to detail every step of the lapsing of these monsters, to tell how day by day the human semblance left them, how they gave up bandagings and wrappings, abandoned at last every stitch of clothing, how the hair began to spread over the exposed limbs, how their foreheads fell away and their faces projected, how the quasi-human intimacy I had permitted myself with some of them in the first month of my loneliness became a shuddering horror to recall. The change was slow and inevitable. For them and for me it came without any definite shock. I still went among them in safety because no jolt in the downward glide had released the increasing charge of explosive animalism that ousted the human day by day. But I began to fear that soon now that shock must come. My St. Bernard brute followed me to the enclosure every night, and his vigilance enabled me to sleep at times in something like peace. The little pink sloth thing became shy and left me to crawl back to its natural life once more among the tree branches. We were in just the state of equilibrium that would remain in one of those happy family cages which animal tamers exhibit if the tamer were to leave it forever. Of course, these creatures did not decline into such beasts as the reader has seen in zoological gardens, into ordinary bears, wolves, tigers, oxen, swine, and apes. There was still something strange about each. In each Moreau had blended this animal with that. One perhaps was ursine chiefly, another feline chiefly, another bovine chiefly, but each was tainted with other creatures, a kind of generalized animalism appearing through the specific dispositions. And the dwindling shreds of the humanity still startled me every now and then. A momentary recrudescence of speech perhaps, an unexpected dexterity of the forefeet, pitiful attempt to walk erect. I too must have undergone strange changes. My clothes hung about me as yellow rags, through whose rents showed the tanned skin. My hair grew long and became matted together. I am told that even now my eyes have a strange brightness, a swift alertness of movement. At first I spent the daylight hours on the southward beach, watching for a ship, hoping and praying for a ship. I counted on the Ipecacuana returning as the year wore on, but she never came. 5 times I saw sails and thrice smoke, but nothing ever touched the island. I always had a bonfire ready, but no doubt the volcanic reputation of the island was taken into account for that. It was only about September or October that I began to think of making a raft. By that time my arm had healed and both my hands were at my service again. At first I found my helplessness appalling. I had never done any carpentry or such-like work in my life, and I spent day after day in experimental chopping and binding among the trees. I had no ropes and could hit on nothing wherewith to make ropes. None of the abundant creepers seemed limber or strong enough, and with all my litter of scientific education I could not devise any way of making them so. I spent more than a fortnight grubbing among the black ruins of the enclosure and on the beach where the boats had been burnt, looking for nails and other stray pieces of metal that might prove of service. Now and then some beast creature would watch me and go leaping off when I called to it. There came a season of thunderstorms and heavy rain which greatly retarded my work, but at last the raft was completed. I was delighted with it, but a certain lack of practical sense which has always been my bane, I had made it a mile or more from the sea, and before I had dragged it down to the beach the thing had fallen to pieces. Perhaps it is as well that I was saved from launching it, but at the time my misery at my failure was so acute that for some days I simply moped on the beach and stared at the water and thought of death. I did not, however, mean to die. and an incident occurred that warned me unmistakably of the folly of letting the days pass so, for each fresh day was fraught with increasing danger from the beast people. I was lying in the shade of the enclosure wall, staring out to sea, when I was startled by something cold touching the skin of my heel, and starting round from the little pink sloth creature blinking into my face. He had long since lost speech and active movement, and the lank hair of the little brute grew thicker every day, and his stumpy claws more askew. He made a moaning noise when he saw he had attracted my attention, went a little way towards the bushes and looked back at me. At first I did not understand, but it presently occurred to me that he wished me to follow him, and this I did at last, slowly, for the day was hot. When we reached the trees, he clambered into them, for he could travel better among their swinging creepers than on the ground, and suddenly in a trampled space I came upon a ghastly group. My St. Bernard creature lay on the ground, dead, and near his body crouched the hyena swine, gripping the quivering flesh with its misshapen claws, gnawing at it and snarling with delight. As I approached, the monster lifted its glaring eyes to mine, its lips went trembling back from its red-stained teeth, and it growled menacingly. It was not afraid and not ashamed. The last vestige of the human taint had vanished. I advanced a step farther, stopped, and pulled out my revolver. At last I had him face to face. The brute made no sign of retreat, but its ears went back, its hair bristled, and its body crouched together. I aimed between the eyes and fired. As I did so, the thing rose straight at me in a leap, and I was knocked over like a ninepin. It clutched at me with its crippled hand and struck me in the face. Its spring carried it over me. I fell under the hind part of its body, but luckily I had hit as I meant, and it had died even as it leapt. I crawled out from under its unclean weight and stood up, trembling, staring at its quivering body. That danger at least was over. But this, I knew, was only the first of the series of relapses that must come. I burnt both of the bodies on a pyre of brushwood, but after that, I saw that unless I left the island, my death was only a question of time. The beast people by that time had, with one or two exceptions, left the ravine, and made themselves lairs according to their taste among the thickets of the island. Few prowled by day. Most of them slept, and the island might have seemed deserted to a newcomer, but at night the air was hideous with their calls and howling. I had half a mind to make a massacre of them, to build traps or fight them with my knife. Had I possessed sufficient cartridges, I should not have hesitated to begin the killing. There could now be scarcely a score left of the dangerous carnivores. The braver of these were already dead. After the death of this poor dog of mine, my last friend, I too adopted to some extent the practice of slumbering in the daytime in order to be on my guard at night. I rebuilt my den in the walls of the enclosure with such a narrow opening that anything attempting to enter must necessarily make a considerable noise. The creatures had lost the art of fire, too, and had recovered their fear of it. I turned once more, almost passionately now, to hammering together stakes and branches to form a raft for my escape. I found 1,000 difficulties. I am an extremely unhandy man. My schooling was over before the days of skjold, but most of the requirements of a raft I met at last in some clumsy, circuitous way or other, and this time I took care of the strength. The only insurmountable obstacle was that I had no vessel to contain the water I should need if I floated forth upon these untravelled seas. I would have even tried pottery, but the island contained no clay. I used to go moping about the island, trying with all my might to solve this one last difficulty. Sometimes I would give way to wild outbursts of rage and hack and splinter some unlucky tree in my intolerable vexation, but I could think of nothing. And then came a day, a wonderful day, which I spent in ecstasy. I saw a sail to the southwest, a small sail like that of a little schooner, and forthwith I lit a great pile of brushwood and stood by it in the heat of it. In the heat of the midday sun, watching. All day I watched that sail, eating or drinking nothing, so that my head reeled and the beasts came and glared at me and seemed to wonder and went away. It was all still distant when the night came and swallowed it up, and all night I toiled to keep my blaze bright and high, and the eyes of the beasts shone out of the darkness, marvelling. In the dawn, the sail was nearer, and I saw it was the dirty lug sail of a small boat, but it sailed strangely. My eyes were weary with watching, and I peered, and I could not believe them. 2 men were in the boat, sitting low down, one by the bows, the other at the rudder. The head was not kept to the wind, it yawed and fell away. As the day grew brighter, I began waving the last rag of my jacket to them, but they did not notice me, and sat still facing each other. I went to the lowest point of the low headland and gesticulated and shouted. There was no response, and the boat kept on her aimless course, making slowly, very slowly, for the bay. Suddenly a great white bird flew up out of the boat, and neither of the men stirred nor noticed it. It circled round and then came sweeping overhead with its strong wings outspread. Then I stopped shouting, and sat down on the headland and rested my chin on my hands and stared. Slowly, slowly the boat drove past to the west. I would have swum out to it, but something, a cold, vague fear, kept me back. In the afternoon the tide stranded the boat, and it left 100 yards or so to the westward of the ruins of the enclosure. The men in it were dead. Had been dead so long that they fell to pieces when I tilted the boat on its side and dragged them out. One had a shock of red hair, like the captain of the Ipecacuana, and a dirty white cap lay in the bottom of the boat. As I stood beside the boat, 3 of the beasts came slinking out of the bushes and sniffing towards me. One of my spasms of disgust came upon me. I thrust the little boat down to the beach and clambered on board her. 2 of the brutes were wolf beasts and came forward with quivering nostrils and glittering eyes. The third was a horrible nondescript of bear and bull. When I saw them approaching, those wretched remains, heard them snarling at one another and caught the gleam of their teeth, frantic horror succeeded my repulsion. I turned my back upon them, struck the lug, and began paddling out to sea. I could not bring myself to look behind me. I lay, however, between the reef and the island that night, and the next morning went round to the stream and filled the empty keg aboard with water. Then, with such patience as I could command, I collected a quantity of fruit and waylaid and killed 2 rabbits with my last 3 cartridges. While I was doing this, I left the boat moored to an inward projection of the reef for fear of the beast people. Chapter 22. The Man Alone. In the evening I started, and drove out to sea before a gentle wind from the southwest, slowly, steadily. And the island grew smaller and smaller, and the lank spire of smoke dwindled to a finer and finer line against the hot sunset. The ocean rose up around me, hiding that low, dark patch from my eyes. The daylight, the trailing glory of the sun went streaming out of the sky, was drawn aside like some luminous curtain, and at last I looked into the blue gulf of immensity which the sunshine hides, and saw the floating hosts of the stars. The sea was silent. The sky was silent. I was alone with the night and silence. So I drifted for 3 days, eating and drinking sparingly and meditating upon all that had happened to me, not desiring very greatly then to see men again. One unclean rag was about me, my hair a black tangle. No doubt my discoverers thought me a madman. It is strange, but I felt no desire to return to mankind. I was only glad to be quit of the foulness of the beast people. And on the 3rd day I was picked up by a brig from Apia to San Francisco. Neither the captain nor the mate would believe my story, judging that solitude and danger had made me mad, and fearing their opinion might be that of others, I refrained from telling my adventure further, and professed to recall nothing that had happened to me between the loss of the Lady Vane and the time when I was picked up again, the space of a year. I had to act with the utmost circumspection to save myself from the suspicion of insanity. My memory of the law, of the 2 dead sailors, of the ambuscades of the darkness, of the body in the canebrake, haunted me. And unnatural as it seems with my return to mankind came, instead of that confidence and sympathy I had expected, a strange enhancement of the uncertainty and dread I had experienced during my stay upon the island. No one would believe me. I was almost as queer to men as I had been to the beast people. I may have caught something of the natural wildness of my companions. They say that terror is a disease, and anyhow I can witness that for several years now a restless fear has dwelt in my mind, such a restless fear as a half-tamed lion cub may feel. My trouble took the strangest form. I could not persuade myself that the men and women I met were not also another beast people, animals half wrought into the outward image of human souls, that they would presently begin to revert, to show first this bestial mark and then that. But I have confided my case to a strangely able man, a man who had known Moreau and seemed half to credit my story, a mental specialist, and he has helped me mightily, although I do not expect that the terror of that island will ever altogether leave me. At most times it lies far in the back of my mind, a mere distant cloud, a memory, and a faint distrust. But there are times when that little cloud spreads until it obscures the whole sky. Then I look about me at my fellow men and I go in fear. I see faces keen and bright, others dull or dangerous, others unsteady, insincere, none that have the calm authority of a reasonable soul. I feel as though the animal was surging up through them, that presently the degradation of the islanders will be played over again on a larger scale. I know this is an illusion, that these seeming men and women about me are indeed men and women forever, perfectly reasonable creatures, full of human desire and tender solicitude, emancipated from instinct and the slaves of no fantastic law, beings altogether different from the beast folk. Yet I shrink from them, from their curious glances, their inquiries and assistance, and long to be away from them and alone. For that reason I live near the broad free downland and can escape thither when this shadow is over my soul, and very sweet is the empty downland then, under the wind-swept sky. When I lived in London the horror was well nigh insupportable. I could not get away from men. Their voices came through windows, locked doors were flimsy safeguards. I would go out in the streets to fight with my delusion, and prowling women would mew after me. Furtive, craving men glanced jealously at me. Weary, pale workers go coughing by me with tired eyes and eager paces, like wounded deer dripping blood. Old people, bent and dull, pass murmuring to themselves, and all unheeding a ragged tale of jibbing children. Then I would turn aside into some chapel, and even there, such was my disturbance, it seemed that the preacher gibbered big thinks, even as the ape man had done. Or into some library, and there the intent faces over the books seem but patient creatures, waiting for prey. Particularly nauseous were the blank, expressionless faces of people in trains and omnibuses. They seemed no more my fellow creatures than dead bodies would be, so that I did not dare to travel unless I was assured of being alone. And even it seemed that I too was not a reasonable creature, but only an animal tormented with some strange disorder in its brain, which sent it to wander alone, like a sheep stricken with gid. This is a mood, however, that comes to me now. I thank God more rarely. I have withdrawn myself from the confusion of cities and multitudes, and spend my days surrounded by wise books, bright windows in this life of ours, lit by the shining souls of men. I see few strangers and have but a small household. My days I devote to reading and to experiments in chemistry, and I spend many of the clear nights in the study of astronomy. There is, though I do not know how there is or why there is, a sense of infinite peace and protection in the glittering hosts of heaven. There it must be, I think, in the vast and eternal laws of matter, and not in the daily cares and sins and troubles of men, that whatever is more than animal within us must find its solace and its hope. I hope, or I could not live. And so, in hope and solitude, my story ends. Edward Prendick. The End.